It's not easy when you're thrown into isolation. So you've got to be kind to yourself a bit and go, yeah, you know what, I don't have to nail this, I just have to survive it.
Hey Jesse Martin, welcome to our series on leading in a changed world.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So the title of this episode is There's Isolation and Then There's Isolation, and I can't think of anybody who has had more experience in this topic than you. Back when you were 17, you started a journey to sail non-stop and unassisted around the world on a sailboat.
I know, hey, it was something I wanted to do, and then all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, it got organised, and then I was just thrown into it and had to deal.
So it was 328 days on a boat by yourself. How on earth does a 17-year-old come to be on a sailboat? How did your mum let you go as a starting point?
Well, you know what? I'd been planning this trip for probably about 3 or 4 years. I didn't necessarily come from a sailing family. So, as it was getting closer to that 3 or 4 years, I needed to leave by a certain age to get the age record to become the youngest person to do it. And my prospects weren't looking good. And as the time was running out, my mother had seen how over the years, every tack I'd taken had been trying to get me in the direction of this trip. And I think she was just a bit heartbroken that perhaps I was going to become too old to do it. And so she mortgaged the family home for $80,000 to buy a yacht. And that was the tipping point for the whole trip, because once we had the boat, the sponsors started to become interested, and within 2 months, all the work was done to the boat. The boat went back in the water 3 days before I had to leave. And then I set off, having sailed on Lionheart, my yacht, for a total of 6 hours on my own. So, yeah, it was, then I was just on my own and, thrown in the deep end.
So I imagine there was a lot of preparation in terms of the food that you take and the communication and all the spares and other things that you would need on that journey. Did you do anything to prepare yourself for the isolation elements of what the next nearly year was going to be like?
You know what, for the isolation, I didn't do any preparation, because how can you do it? I was 17. My preparation had been reading all the books and going to boat shows and collecting brochures and thinking about equipment. How do you prepare for isolation? And I now think that for a world trip like that, the training, it's really hard to train. It's one of those things I feel like you have to throw yourself into. And so, when I got out there, what I found was I was completely shell-shocked, because I hadn't prepared myself for feeling so alone so immediately. And and so it was probably the hardest part of the whole journey. It was an 11-month trip, but that first month was the hardest, because I spent the whole month thinking, how am I going to survive another 11 months feeling like this?
So talk me through the first month. What was going through your head? Did you just think that, hey, I'm not going to be able to do this and be alone for the next 11 months?
I did. I felt the pressure, that my mum had put so much into the trip for me. So, I didn't want to just give in. When I got back and I was writing my book, I was going through my diary, and I saw there that I'd written at the beginning, I wish something would happen to the yacht so I could be rescued and it wouldn't be my choice. That's how hard, it was feeling. And I was just super down, because I describe it as being like that Sunday afternoon feeling where you're just in limbo. I wasn't into the trip yet, and I just left land, and I just had to get used to so many new things, and that's disconcerting, for anybody to go through. So what I found was that I was also anxious of bad weather, because I knew it was going to happen. And so it was around a month into the trip that I went through my first gale and made some mistakes.
Can you talk through the impact of a gale? What's happening when you're going through a gale?
Well, life on a boat, on a small boat, is always moving. things are always rocking around. There's always noises, creaks. There was water dripping here and there, on my boat anyway. So it's uncomfortable, and that's something you need to get used to. But you do, over time, you get used to, things being damp. In a gale, the movement is just more consistent. And, one of the ideas about sailing is that as a sailor, you feel self-contained on a yacht, and you want to be able to get your boat from one port to the next. And so, if you happen to lose your mast or things break, you have to be prepared to fix them on your own. And so when you're in a gale, that stress is in the back of your mind. Am I pushing things too hard? I don't want to have to do emergency repairs. I know I will if I have to, but I don't want to. So, just listening to everything all the time. And then, of course, you've got the howl of the wind. It doesn't sound fun, does it?
And I can imagine when you're in the middle of an ocean, the fear that comes with that noise and the fear that comes with the isolation must be pretty intense.
Yes, yeah. There's certain hurdles and levels to, I think, getting into the rhythm of a journey. One of them is when you leave sight of land. That's an emotional hurdle that you need to get over.
I've just been knocked down while I was outside twice trying to set the drogue. Everything's wet inside. I'm scared. I'm cold.
But then after a while, you're like, it doesn't matter if there's no land around. The boat still floats. And so it goes on, and there's more hurdles, and there's more getting used to it. And so after I went through my first gale, and the boat was knocked over while I was outside, and I got quite a fright. I accidentally, mistakenly threw a parachute anchor out the wrong side of the yacht. It got caught around the keel, and I had to cut it free, and it was my only parachute anchor for the journey.
And so what's a parachute anchor used for?
We use the parachute anchor you set it in the water. It's like a big parachute, and you tie it off the bow of your yacht, and it just anchors your boat in the sea in a way. It holds the nose of the boat into the waves, which is the best angle for a boat to have heavy weather approach it. So I didn't have that option anymore. I had to just go with the weather from then on. But a few days afterwards, I started to get a bit more confident because I'd now been through a gale, and yes, I'd made mistakes, but it was definitely a confidence booster because not everyone goes through a gale at sea on their own, and I knew that, and I knew I'd made mistakes, but I also felt proud that I was still there.
And obviously, having gone through the first one, it gave you confidence about the next one and the next one that might come after that.
Exactly. Yes. From that point on, I'd spent a fair bit of the first month quite upset, just from loneliness. But after that turning point, my confidence was building, and each lot of strong weather that came through, I was learning more how to handle the boat. And of course, I was getting closer to Cape Horn, which represents such a big milestone for sailors. And so, what was initially fear started to turn to excitement.
And so was the milestone because of the where Cape Horn is in the journey, or was the milestone actually seeing Cape Horn? What was the excitement piece around that?
Well, Cape Horn, it's an historical cape on the world sailing scene because it's so far south. It's the furthest most southern cape. Yachts have to go down to 56 degrees south, which is, in the iceberg zone. So depending which time of year, you can see icebergs when you're heading south. It's cold, and you've just got the whole Southern Ocean, the weather systems passing through and clipping that tip. And so, for the few weeks that it takes to get down there and then back up, you're exposing yourself to any lot of weather that comes through.
So when we talked off camera before, you talked about being isolated from people, and I want to come back to that. But you also talked about being isolated from things of convenience and being isolated from space as well. Can you explain those in a bit more detail?
You know, the technology I had when I did my trip back in 1998, there was a satellite phone I had, but it was so expensive to use. I had a radio, but you can't always reach people, and if you can, it might be at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And so, you know, the convenience of communication was just very limited. It still is, you know, to quite a degree when you go that remote. It was a curse, you know, not being able to just pick up the phone, but it also was a blessing. What I learnt to love about being out there was how not having interruptions, you know, where you can go in your mind and your feelings when the bombardment isn't there.
So you're talking about in terms of a positive way rather than a negative way?
A positive way, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I really, you know, for days I would just think about certain things and fine-tune ideas, and for me that's what I love to do. You know, I love planning my world trip as much as I love doing the world trip. And so when I was on my sailing trip, I was also planning other trips. And so, you know, being out on the water, I could just do that. So that was a great thing about it.
So that was giving you the opportunity really to take advantage of your isolation and use that for other things outside of just the core duties and responsibilities you had on the boat.
Exactly. You know, and I had time to read, and, you know, I've since thought, you know, these people that write such great books and, you know, they can take us away, you know, in their imagination. Maybe they have been in a similar situation to me. Maybe they've been isolated somewhere and they've just been able to let their mind and imagination run, and then they've written and crafted this beautiful story. And so, you know, I felt like on my journey that I was in a lifestyle and a way of life that was very different to what a lot of people experience, and special and universal, you know. I did definitely feel like Columbus in a way, in my own little world, you know, setting off, and life felt really purposeful, simplified but purposeful.
So what were the things that you did, or the messages that you received, or things along the way that made it better for you to cope with, you know, the isolation while you're on the boat? Look,
I used to get once every few weeks one big email with all the vowels taken out, so it was cheaper.
So the emails, you're paying for the messages based on the number of characters?
Back then, yeah, exactly. In Inmarsat at sea, you got charged 1 cent per character, and so just to keep costs down, we would send messages without vowels, and you know, so it took a little bit of deciphering sometimes what the message meant.
Well, you had time on your hands, so that would have been okay.
Exactly. What I would do is every few weeks get one email which was a condensed message from all my friends. So, you know, I'd read this message and then it would have who it was from, Trav, you know, and then it would be straight into the next message. So I just have all these words. And they were hugely important to me. You know, obviously they didn't come through as often enough as I would have liked. But every day I would look at the little orange light, because that would, if that LED light was on, it indicated there was a message waiting. And, you know, it was once a day I had a weather forecast. And so if I'd already got my weather forecast and it came on again, I started to think, oh, maybe this is the day I get a group message from all my friends. So wow. That was always something to look forward to.
Yeah. And so why was that important? Was it what they said, or the fact that they just thought about you to send you a message, or was it, you know, just a slight connection to home? What was it that meant so much to you?
You know, I think this is particular to being at sea. You can only think about some things so much. And so, you know, you need new material or new ideas or new... And so just having messages from home about friends, about what they were doing, it just opened up a whole other branch in my mind that I could go into imagining. And so that's why it was important. To keep in touch and to know that they're thinking of me, but also, you know, motivation to get to the end, because I knew they were there at the end and I'd see them again and I would be back in that world again one day.
You've talked about some of the things that really made the trip easier for you to cope with, and the hardest time being the first month. What other times during the other 10 months were things really hard and you had to dig really deep?
After rounding Cape Horn, I started heading north to my halfway point in the North Atlantic, and I learnt that my family were taking time off work and flying to the Azores, the islands that I was rounding, to meet me. Now, I couldn't stop and they couldn't get on board, but they planned to come alongside in another boat so we could talk.
So just so you could see them, there's no hugging, there's no kissing, there's no, other than just seeing them on another boat.
That's it. Yeah, under the rules for the record I was going for, there was a certain amount of handwritten mail I could receive under a certain weight, and I could throw off rubbish bags, but that was it. No other contact. So I was looking forward to this rendezvous for so many weeks. I hadn't considered to prepare myself for how I would feel when it was over, and so, when they came out, and they took a while to find me and they were running low on fuel, so we only got to speak boat alongside boat for 40 minutes, and then they had to go back to land.
I want to take you home and tuck you into a warm bed.
So they've flown across the other side of the world to see you for 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then instantly I was again on my own like that, almost like the day I left, but different to the day I left, because now I knew what that amount of time alone felt like, and I could also look forward and go, oh, that again, So that was one of, the harder times really, because I knew what was ahead. I knew what the time felt like.
Yeah, and how much time did you have between that moment when they left and the anticipated end of the trip?
It was the same time again, 5 months.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did you cope with that next period of time?
Well, it just, I always found this after hugely emotional moments on the trip that, I just needed a good sleep. I needed a good sleep, and I needed the weather to turn good. I needed to wake up in the morning and go out there and go, oh, the day is good, pull up some sail and get moving. And that's what happened, Ironically, at that halfway meeting, they flew home again and I was stuck around the islands for about a week with no wind. So, it was incredibly frustrating, because I was sitting there going, well, why couldn't they come out now? I've got no wind. But when the wind picked up again and I was heading south, I think just the motivation of being on the journey again and reminding myself, okay, this is your normal life out here. That wasn't normal. Seeing people's not normal. Being on your own, this time, this is your normal thing, so just get on with it.
Yeah, so reframing where you are, what you're aiming for, I assume thinking forward to the finish line, changing your thinking to focus on that rather than focus on what you've just lost.
Yeah, exactly, exactly right, yeah. And it was like that at the beginning. When I left, the shortest distance to getting home is obviously if I'd turned around and just gone back to Melbourne, but I couldn't think like that. I had to see the finish line as that way, away from home. I just had to always remind myself that that's the only way to get home, the long way.
Now, you've written a couple of books. I've got one here, which I've had sitting on my bookshelf for more than a decade, I reckon. And you've got a quote in one of your books that says, "I think there is such a thing as unity in isolation. The idea of other people out on their own is comforting. I think the best things occur when these individuals individually work at the same thing." Can you explain that in a bit more depth?
To go back a bit, my journey represented for me a transition from being somebody who was led into taking my own adventure on and leading myself. And so I think that passage there is just a reflection on that process. We're all born children, and we all most of us get to become adults. I suppose childhood is fun and in the moment if you're experiencing it, but I think the world would be a better place if the adults were more adults, more individuals, and I think the best things occur when people that are pioneering something in their own way, in their own field, because of their own interest, come together and share what they've gained. That's what that passage means.
Now, so if you're starting your journey or your voyage again today, would you do anything differently to prepare?
I would. There'd be a few more things on the equipment list. I forgot to take a comb with me. That's one thing. There's heaps of things.
You forgot to take some scissors to cut your hair too.
I know. Yeah. No, you know what that was about? That was going to a school where you weren't allowed to grow your hair past the top of your ear. So as soon as I got out there, I was like, I'm not cutting this. It was the late 90s. But you know what? A lot of time spent out there was actually planning how I would do the trip better. And I think that's a good thing to take forward. I think people do that naturally, perfecting things. Perfecting the layout of the boat. I'd hate to take a hard dodger. The first wave that came over my boat knocked my fabric dodger off, and so the dodger is.
So what's the dodger?
The dodger is when the companionway, which slides forward for you to step down into the cabin, is covered by a dodger, so you can dodge the waves as they come across, and they're usually clear in parts. Mine was made of fabric, and it just got washed off from the first big wave that came over. So I would take a solid dodger. A lot of people now make solid dodgers. Lessons like that.
So have you got any plans for future adventure?
Yeah, look, I've got heaps of plans, and they keep changing. What was good about my Lionheart trip was once you start, you can't stop. And so going forward, I guess I've got a baby daughter now and a family. And so it'd be great to, introduce her to what I love, sailing, traveling by sailboat when she's older. So I've also had a trip to the Arctic planned for a very long time by canoe. So I'll see if she's into that type of thing, but maybe that's something we can do together.
So today you have your own production company?
Yeah, I've always had a little business on the side, shooting videos and so forth. I've always taken cameras on my adventures. So a couple of years ago, when we were living on our boat before we had our daughter, we had the chance to go over to France for the Golden Globe yacht race, which is a rerun of a 50-year anniversary rerun of the original around the world yacht race, the first time anyone sailed around without stopping. And so in 2018, 18 yachts left on this recreated adventure, and 5 boats finished. And so it was a fascinating recreation. And the race is being run again in 2022. So we're working on that documentary at the moment, all the footage from the boats and all the material interviews we shot before the race and after the race.
So before we wrap up, I wondered maybe if you had 3 sort of key takeaways for our viewers in how they could best deal with isolation at this time in the world.
Okay, look, first I think it's important probably to divulge the fact that at the beginning on my trip, when things weren't going well for me, I had the luxury of just being able to crack it. I could swear at the weather, I could lose my shit, and no one was there to see. And so I think that's probably an important thing to make note of, that it's not easy when you're thrown into isolation. So you've got to be kind to yourself a bit and go, you know what, I don't have to nail this, I just have to survive it. So that's the first point. And moving on, I think if I think back to my trip, because my communications were limited, what it meant was that the messages I sent were quite thought out or particular or meaningful. And so, it was a way I was able to use my isolation to my advantage. I couldn't just ramble on all day. I needed to be clear. And so, quality over quantity when it comes to communication, I think, is something that we can use to our advantage in these times.
And a third one?
Third one. You know what? What I always did was I had my eye on the finish line. Even though I loved it out there and I was, being a sailor and in that world, I was constantly thinking what I was going to do when I get home. I was picturing the finish line. And so that was always used as the motivation. With this pandemic, there is an end to it. And so we just got to remember that and just think how great it's going to be when it's over.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Mate, thank you so much for spending some time today talking about your story, and thanks for inspiring, I think, so many people, from your journey to follow their dreams as well. I really appreciate your time, man.
Welcome, Ben. No worries.